Here I am, or rather, here I was, back in mid-December, at the Trellick Tower. It's one of the most famous, some would say infamous, tower blocks in London. And this here is its older brother, the Balfron Tower in Poplar. Join me for a tale of architecture, of personalities, and of literal Bond villainy. The towers were designed by the Hungarian architect Erno Goldfinger. Erno was, shall we say, a forceful personality. Actually, by all accounts, he was a humorless tyrant to work for, with a tendency to get handsy with his female staff. He fired people so readily that on one occasion he gave the sack to somebody who was just visiting the office. He made enemies of his employees, of builders, of other architects, and most notably of all, James Bond. Ian Fleming, the author of the Bond novels, was a man with an eye for unusual details, interesting anecdotes, news stories and names, and Goldfinger stood out to him. While there are stories claiming that Fleming hated Goldfinger's architecture or had met Goldfinger personally and disliked him, there's no evidence to back this up. In any case, the book Goldfinger was published in 1959, before Goldfinger the architect's best-known buildings had gone up. Despite this, Goldfinger the architect was not at all happy about being associated with Bond villains and threatened to sue the publishers, Jonathan Cape. Jonathan Cape was somewhat nervous and asked Fleming if he would consider changing the name. Fleming counselled them not to be bullied by Golden Finger, as he put it, and suggested Gold Prick as an alternative name, which wouldn't be as easy to work into a Shirley Bassey song, but I'm sure she could come up with something. In the end, the publishers compromised with an all characters are fictional disclaimer. I'm probably not painting a very pleasant picture of Goldfinger the man, so let's look at some positives. Whatever else you could say about Goldfinger, he wasn't a snob. He had no qualms about public work, unlike a lot of prominent architects at the time. For instance, he designed the Ministry of Health headquarters, Alexander Fleming House, in Elephant and Castle. Perhaps this attitude towards public work arose from the fact that politically he was a Marxist. I mean an actual Marxist, not the Daily Mail definition of a Marxist. But it's his tower blocks that we're interested in. The first was Balfron Tower, which was designed in 1963 and built by the Greater London Council, being opened in 1968. The Balfron Tower was followed shortly afterwards by the adjoining Carradale House and Glenkerry House opposite. All three sit on the appealingly named Brownfield Estate. Tower blocks were all the rage in social housing at the time because they maximised usable space and were relatively cheap. Goldfinger intended Balfron to be the prototype for an entire series of blocks across the country. He and his wife Ursula even lived in Balfron for 2 months to see what it was like. As he put it, "I want to experience firsthand the size of the rooms, the amenities provided, the time it takes to obtain a lift, the amount of wind whistling around the tower, and any problems which might arise from my design so I can correct them in future." It was his belief that all architects should live in a home they have designed themselves. He had to move out after 2 months, though, because he wasn't eligible for council housing. He claimed that he felt uncomfortable after moving back to his house in Hampstead, which he also designed. Balfron Tower is certainly distinctive. The most obvious feature is the separate tower that houses the lifts, the rubbish chutes and the boiler rooms, which gives the whole thing an asymmetrical look. It's designed in rough concrete in the true brutalist fashion, but it's not just about the style of the thing. Each flat has dual-aspect windows, so residents always get sunlight. The space was mathematically calculated to determine how much a person would need to feel comfortable. One of Goldfinger's inspirations was the French architect Le Corbusier, which is of course French for the Corbusier. Le Corbusier was hugely influential on modernist architecture and devised the modular, a system of space based on human proportions. As a side note, Le Corbusier wasn't the first to come up with the concept, and Goldfinger's rooms have been described as Georgian in their proportions. But the tower wasn't without its problems. It could get rather cold due to poor insulation. Residents complained of feeling cooped up and isolated. While the space was excellent for a couple like the Goldfingers, it could get very crowded for families. There were issues with maintenance and crime. Vandalism was reported almost from the first opening, partly because just anyone could enter the tower from the street, whether resident or not. And the building's bold outline was compared to a prison block or concrete bunker by non-residents and architectural critics alike. By the 90s there was a rampant drug problem. However, according to 28 Days Later, it is a pretty good place to hole up against zombies. Despite all this, Goldfinger felt that he had learnt his lessons and took them to West London, where he'd build an even bigger and more famous tower. Join me in part 2 to learn about the Trellick Tower and the ultimate fate of Balfron. If you're not already subscribed, you might want to do so and hit the bell icon so you'll know when it shows up. And I'll see you then. Cheerio.